He divorced her when she was broke. Days later, he found out who she really was. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Isla Moreau sat on the edge of a sagging mattress in a budget hotel room that smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet, staring at the unknown number flashing across her screen. International, Switzerland. She almost didn't answer. Her entire world had collapsed in the span of 1 week. Her father was dead. Her marriage was over. She had exactly $417 in her checking account and nowhere to call home. The last thing she needed was a scam call from overseas. But something made her swipe to answer. Miss Moreau. The voice was crisp, British female, professional in a way that suggested expensive education and even more expensive suits. My name is Victoria Sterling. I'm calling from the London office of Whitmore and Associates. I'm the executor of your father's estate. Isla's throat went dry. My father didn't have an estate. He was a philosophy professor. He lived in a 1,500 square foot house and drove a car older than I am. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that precedes everything changing. Miss Moreau, I need you to come to London immediately. There are matters concerning your inheritance that require your signature and presence. Inheritance. The word sounded foreign. Impossible. 4 days ago, Isla had stood alone at her father's graveside in the rain, watching his casket lower into the ground while her husband, her ex-husband, sat in a restaurant across town with the woman he'd been sleeping with for the past year. 3 days ago, she'd signed divorce papers that left her with nothing, not the apartment, not the car, not even the furniture they'd bought together. Julian's lawyer had made sure of that, and Julian had sat there in that sterile conference room with Camille beside him, her hand on his arm, and he'd looked at Isla like she was a problem he'd finally solved. I don't understand, Isla said into the phone. My father didn't have anything to leave. He lived simply. He never. Your father, Victoria Sterling interrupted gently, was known to you as Dr. Thomas Moreau, adjunct professor of philosophy. That was one of his identities. His legal name was Thomas Ashford Sterling. And Miss Moreau, he was one of the wealthiest human beings to ever live. The room tilted. Isla heard herself laugh. A sharp, broken sound. That's impossible. You have the wrong person. My father shopped at thrift stores. He ate the same lunch every day for 20 years. There's no way. Miss Moreau. Victoria's voice was patient, but firm. Your father's estate is valued at approximately $2.3 trillion, and you are the sole heir. The phone slipped from Isla's hand and hit the carpet with a muffled thud. She could hear Victoria's voice, tinny and distant, calling her name. But Isla couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she'd just heard. 2.3 trillion. The number didn't even sound real. It sounded like something from a news report about national debts or global markets, not something connected to the quiet man who had raised her, who had taught her to read using philosophy texts, who had never, not once in 32 years, given her any indication that he was anything other than exactly what he appeared to be. Have you ever been told you're worth nothing, only to discover they couldn't have been more wrong? Have you ever signed away your rights to a man who convinced you that you brought nothing to the table while secretly you owned the building his success was built on? Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you, what Isla was about to discover, will restore your faith in karma and make you question everything you thought you knew about power, wealth, and revenge. But first, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications, because this story doesn't go where you think it's going, and you don't want to miss a single moment of what happens when the woman everyone underestimated becomes the most powerful person in the room. Do it now. I'll wait. Let me take you back. 11 years earlier, before the money, before the betrayal, before everything fell apart. Back to when Isla still believed that love could survive anything. She met Julian in a bookstore on a Tuesday evening in October. The kind of independent bookstore that smelled like old paper and coffee and had mismatched furniture where people actually sat and read instead of just taking photos for social media. Isla was 21, working part-time shelving books while taking night classes in art history at the community college. She had dreams back then, big dreams. She wanted to work in museums, wanted to curate exhibitions, wanted to spend her life surrounded by beauty and meaning. Julian was in the poetry section, running his finger along the spines like he was searching for something specific. He was 24, first-year law student, handsome in an approachable way, not polished yet, not the man he would become. He wore jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt, and had the kind of smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. "You have good taste," he said when Isla reached past him for a volume of Neruda. They talked for 3 hours, about books, about dreams, about the lives they wanted to build. Julian told her about growing up in a working-class neighborhood, watching his father break his back in construction while his mother cleaned other people's houses. He told her he was going to be different, going to make something of himself, going to build a life where money wasn't a constant source of fear and stress. Isla told him about her father, the quiet philosophy professor who lived alone and seemed content with a life most people would find boring. She told Julian about her own dreams, about wanting to make art accessible to people who thought museums weren't for them, about believing that beauty mattered, that meaning mattered. When Julian kissed her that night under the streetlights outside the bookstore, Isla felt something she'd never felt before, like she'd found a partner, someone who understood that life was about building something together, someone who valued the same things she did: hard work, loyalty, love that didn't quit when things got difficult. 2 years later, Julian proposed in the parking lot of an all-night diner at 2 a.m. They'd just finished a study session. Isla had been quizzing him for his contracts exam while eating French fries and drinking bad coffee, and he'd looked at her across that sticky table and said, "I don't want to do any of this without you. Marry me." She said yes before he'd even finished the question. Their wedding was small, City Hall on a Thursday afternoon, because they couldn't afford to take time off work for a weekend ceremony. Isla wore a white dress from a vintage shop that cost $47. Julian wore his only suit. They had dinner afterward at a small Italian restaurant with a handful of friends. No honeymoon, no expensive reception, just two people starting a life together with more love than money and the absolute conviction that it would be enough. Isla's father came to the wedding. He didn't say much. He never did. Thomas Moreau was a small man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses who seemed to take up less space than he actually occupied. He shook Julian's hand, kissed Isla's cheek, told her quietly that he hoped she'd be happy, and then he went home to his modest house on the edge of town where he lived alone and worked on projects Isla had never quite understood. Julian didn't like him, thought he was cold, detached. He complained more than once that Thomas never offered to help them financially, even though they were drowning in student loans and working multiple jobs just to make rent. "He's your father," Julian would say, frustration bleeding into his voice. "He sees us struggling. Why doesn't he do something?" Isla always defended him. "My father lives simply. He probably doesn't have much to give. And besides, we're managing. We don't need handouts." But privately, late at night when she couldn't sleep, Isla wondered the same thing. Why did her father just watch them suffer? Why didn't he step in? Was it principle? Was it indifference? She never asked, never pushed, just accepted that Thomas Moreau showed love in quiet ways that didn't involve money or grand gestures. The first 2 years of marriage were brutally hard. Julian's classes consumed him. He studied 16 hours a day, stressed about grades, about internships, about whether he'd actually make it in a profession where competition was vicious and unforgiving. Isla picked up the slack. She worked mornings at a grocery store stocking shelves, afternoons at the library where they'd met, weekends cleaning offices for a commercial janitorial company. She came home exhausted, made dinner from whatever was cheapest at the store, and listened to Julian talk about his cases and his professors and his anxieties about the future. She never complained, never pointed out that she'd put her own dreams on hold, that she'd dropped out of school because they couldn't afford tuition for both of them, that she was working herself into the ground so he could succeed. She believed in him, believed in them, believed that once he graduated and got a good job, things would get easier. They'd buy a house, maybe have kids, maybe she'd go back to school. The struggle was temporary. The love was permanent, or so she thought. Her father called every Sunday at 9 a.m, like clockwork. The conversations were always the same, short, surface level, affectionate, in a reserved way that felt very much like Thomas Moreau. "How are you, Isla?" "I'm fine, Dad." "Tired, but fine." "Are you eating enough? Getting enough sleep?" "As much as I can." "Okay." I love you. I love you too. That was it. No long talks. No advice about her marriage, or her abandoned dreams, or the exhaustion that had become her default state. Just quiet love that Isla didn't know how to interpret. She wished sometimes that he'd ask more questions, show more interest, but that wasn't who he was. Thomas Moreau was a man who observed from a distance, who kept his thoughts to himself, who loved in a language Isla had never quite learned to speak. Then, Julian graduated, top 15% of his class, good enough to get interviews at mid-tier firms, not quite good enough for the white-shoe corporate firms he'd dreamed about. He took a position at Morrison & Blake, a respectable firm that specialized in corporate law. The salary was decent, not spectacular, but enough that Isla could finally quit one of her jobs. She kept working at the library. She liked it there, liked the quiet, liked helping people find books, liked feeling useful in a way that wasn't just about survival. And she started taking one class per semester at the community college again. Just one, art history. Her old dream revived in small, manageable pieces. For a while, things were good. Not easy, but good. They moved into a better apartment, started going out to dinner occasionally, talked about the future with something that felt like hope instead of desperation. But then Julian started winning cases, started getting noticed, started moving up, and something shifted, something Isla didn't recognize at first, didn't want to recognize. The more successful Julian became, the less he looked at her. The more money he made, the more he seemed embarrassed by the years when she'd been the one holding everything together. He started working late, started missing dinners, started talking about his career in a way that didn't include her, that didn't acknowledge that his success had been built on her sacrifice. Drop yes in the comments if you've ever felt invisible to someone you loved, if you've ever given everything to a person only to watch them forget what you gave, and hit that like button if you're ready to see how this story flips everything upside down, because Isla's about to discover something that will change not just her life, but the lives of everyone who thought they knew who she was. Vanessa entered the picture 2 years after Julian made junior partner. She worked in marketing for one of the firm's biggest clients, a tech company on the verge of a major acquisition. Tall, polished, always dressed in clothes that whispered expensive rather than shouted it. She had the kind of confidence that came from never having struggled, from never having worried about rent or groceries or whether the car would make it another month. Julian started mentioning her name, casually at first. Vanessa said this in the meeting. Vanessa suggested that strategy. Vanessa thinks we should pursue this angle. Then he started working late on cases that involved her company, started coming home smelling like perfume that wasn't Isla's, started looking at his phone and smiling in a way he hadn't smiled at Isla in years. Isla knew. Of course she knew. You don't spend 9 years with someone and not notice when they've left the marriage even if their body is still sleeping in the bed next to you. But she didn't say anything, didn't confront him, didn't demand answers. She just kept hoping it would pass, that it was a phase, that Julian would remember who she was, what they'd been through together, what they'd built. He didn't remember, or maybe he did. And that was the problem. Maybe every time he looked at Isla, he saw those years of struggle, those years when he was nobody, those years when she'd seen him at his most vulnerable and powerless. And maybe he'd started to resent her for it, started to see her as evidence of a past he wanted to erase. Her father got sick in the fall. It started small, a cough that wouldn't go away, weight loss. He attributed to stress, fatigue that seemed more than just age catching up. Isla noticed during one of their Sunday calls, he sounded different, weaker. She drove to his house unannounced and found him thinner than she'd ever seen him, gray in a way that had nothing to do with his hair. She made him go to the doctor, then to a specialist, then to an oncologist who delivered news that felt like a physical blow. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, advanced, inoperable. They could try chemotherapy, but the doctor's tone made it clear that try was the operative word. 6 months, maybe less. Isla moved back home to take care of him, took a leave of absence from the library, set up her laptop in his cluttered study so she could work remotely on the few freelance projects she'd picked up, turned his living room into a makeshift care facility with medications and medical equipment and a hospital bed that looked obscene in the space where her father used to read and think and live his quiet life. Julian didn't visit, Not in the first week, not in the first month. He called occasionally, brief conversations filled with excuses. I'm slammed at work, babe. This acquisition is taking everything. I'll come this weekend. Then the weekend would arrive, and he wouldn't. He'd text instead. Sorry. Emergency at the office. You understand. She did understand. She understood that her husband had checked out of their marriage and was just waiting for a clean exit. She understood that he was spending his free time with Vanessa. She understood that she was losing two people she loved. One to cancer, one to cowardice. Here's what Isla didn't know, couldn't have known. While she was sitting beside her father's bed, reading to him from the philosophy texts he'd spent his life teaching, while she was managing his pain medication and helping him to the bathroom, and pretending not to notice how quickly he was fading, her father was watching her, making notes, making plans, and making absolutely certain that when the truth came out, it would come out at exactly the right moment. Because Thomas Moreau, Thomas Ashford Sterling, hadn't spent 40 years building an empire to watch his daughter be discarded like she was worthless. He had a plan, and Isla was about to inherit more than money. She was about to inherit justice. 4 months after the diagnosis, Thomas Moreau died on a Tuesday morning. Quietly, peacefully, Isla was holding his hand, reading from Marcus Aurelius, when she felt his grip relax. She looked up and saw that he was gone. Just like that. No dramatic final speech, no last-minute revelations. Just a quiet man, leaving a quiet life. Or so it seemed. The funeral was small. A handful of colleagues from the university who barely knew him. A neighbor who'd lived next door for 15 years and could only offer generic condolences. A coworker Isla had never met who introduced herself as someone who'd collaborated with Thomas on research projects. The chaplain who performed the service mispronounced his name twice. It rained. Of course, it rained. Isla stood at the graveside in a black dress she'd bought at a discount store, holding an umbrella that kept flipping inside out in the wind, watching her father's casket lower into the ground. She was alone, completely alone. The handful of attendees had already left, gone back to their lives, their routines, their worlds that would continue spinning as if Thomas Moreau had never existed. Julian sent a text. Sorry, babe. Back-to-back meetings. I'll make it up to you. He didn't make it up to her. 3 days later, while Isla was still at her father's house trying to figure out what to keep and what to let go, a courier knocked on the door. She signed for the envelope, without thinking, opened it, standing in the hallway surrounded by boxes of her father's books, and read the words that made her knees go weak. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Julian Moreau versus Isla Moreau. Her husband wanted a divorce, and according to the paperwork his lawyer had drafted, he wanted everything. The apartment they'd saved for, the car, the joint savings account, the furniture, everything. The document outlined in cold legal language how Isla had contributed nothing of value to the marriage, how she had been financially dependent, how she had no claim to assets acquired during Julian's career advancement. Isla sat down on the floor, right there in the hallway, divorce papers in one hand, her father's death certificate in the other, and she felt something crack inside her, not her heart, that had been breaking slowly for years, something deeper, some foundational belief that good things happened to good people, that love mattered, that loyalty counted for something. She called the number on the paperwork, spoke to Julian's attorney, a woman named Miss Greenwood, who sounded efficient and utterly indifferent to Isla's devastation. We can schedule mediation if you'd like, Miss Greenwood said. But I'll be frank, you don't have much to negotiate with. No income, no assets in your name, no children. This should be straightforward. Isla hired Robert Chen, the only attorney she could afford, pro bono work through a legal aid society. Robert was kind, tired. He had too many cases and not enough time. But he listened. And then he got angry on her behalf. You supported him through law school, he said, his voice rising. You worked 3 jobs. You sacrificed your own education, your own career. You're entitled to half of everything he has now. But Isla was tired, so tired. Tired of fighting, tired of hoping, tired of loving someone who looked at her like she was an obstacle instead of a partner. I just want it to be over, she told Robert. I'll sign whatever he wants. I just want to be done. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Isla spent those 2 weeks sorting through her father's house in a fog, She found things that confused her. Bank statements from institutions she'd never heard of. Legal documents with names that weren't his. A safe in his closet she didn't know the combination to. She set it all aside. Told herself she'd deal with it later. After the divorce. After she figured out where she was going to live and how she was going to survive. The courtroom was small. Sterile. Fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. Julian sat on one side with Ms. Greenwood. He wore an expensive suit. Isla recognized it. She'd seen it in his closet, but had never seen him wear it. He'd bought it after she'd moved out, after he'd already decided their marriage was over. Beside him sat Camille. She wore a cream-colored silk blouse and tailored pants, and looked absolutely at home in this room where Isla's life was being dismantled. She wasn't hiding, wasn't embarrassed. She sat there with her hand resting on Julian's arm like she'd already won, like this was just a formality. The judge was an older woman who looked like she'd presided over 1,000 of these hearings and had stopped caring about the human cost somewhere around case number 500. She reviewed the documents with the detached efficiency of someone processing paperwork rather than lives. "Mr. Moreau," she said, "you're seeking full ownership of marital assets based on sole income contribution during the marriage." Julian stood. He looked at Isla, and he said the words slowly, deliberately, like he wanted her to feel every syllable. "Your Honor, I married a woman with nothing, and she's leaving this marriage with exactly what she brought into it. Nothing." The courtroom was silent. Isla didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't cry. She just sat there while the man she'd loved for 9 years, the man she'd sacrificed everything for, told a judge that she was worthless. Robert touched her arm. "Isla, you don't have to accept this." But she did. She accepted it because fighting would require energy she didn't have, would require believing that she deserved something better. And sitting in that courtroom, watching Camille smile, watching Julian look at her with something close to contempt, Isla couldn't quite believe that anymore. She signed the papers. The judge finalized the divorce. Julian and Camille stood and left without a word. Their footsteps echoed on the tile floor. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and Isla sat there, wondering how she'd arrived at this moment, how her life had narrowed to this single point: divorced, orphaned, alone. Robert gathered his papers slowly. "I'm sorry, Isla. You deserve better than this." She nodded, thanked him, walked out into rain that had started again. She had nowhere to go. The apartment was Julian's now. Her father's house was still full of boxes and grief she wasn't ready to face. So she walked, through the rain, through streets that didn't care about her heartbreak, until she found herself standing in front of a budget hotel on the edge of downtown. The room was small, smelled like industrial cleaner, had a bed with a sagging mattress and a television that only got basic cable. Isla sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the damp clothes from the courthouse, still holding her purse with the finalized divorce decree inside, and she stared at the wall and wondered what came next, wondered if there was a next, wondered if this was just what life was now. Empty rooms and empty futures, and the crushing weight of being told you're nothing by the person who was supposed to see your everything. That's when the phone rang. International number, Switzerland, and Victoria Sterling's voice saying words that didn't make sense. "Your father's estate, $2.3 trillion. Sole heir. Would you have believed it? If you were sitting in that hotel room, if you'd just lost everything, would you have thought it was real or just another cruelty, another cosmic joke? Comment below and tell me, because what Isla did next, how she processed this information, how she decided to handle the power she'd just inherited, that's where this story really begins. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, do it now, because we're about to enter the part of this story where everything you thought you knew gets turned upside down, where the woman who signed away her rights becomes the woman who controls everything, where quiet power reveals itself in ways that will make you rethink everything you believe about justice and karma and what it means to truly win. Isla didn't sleep that night. She sat on the hotel bed with her laptop open, staring at the documents Victoria Sterling had emailed, PDFs with legal seals and signatures and numbers that seemed to have too many zeros, holdings in companies she'd heard of, tech giants, pharmaceutical firms, energy corporations, real estate portfolios spanning 4 continents, art collections valued in the hundreds of millions, investment funds that moved billions every quarter, and at the center of it all, her father, the quiet man who had driven a 20-year-old Volvo and eaten the same lunch, turkey sandwich, apple, black coffee, for as long as Isla could remember. The man who had shopped at thrift stores and lived in a 1,500-square-foot house and never once indicated that he was anything other than exactly what he appeared to be. She called Victoria back at 3 in the morning. London time made it 8 a.m. Victoria answered on the second ring, like she'd been expecting it. "This isn't real," Isla said. "It can't be real." Victoria's voice was patient. "I understand your shock, Miss Moreau. This is a lot to process. But I assure you, everything in those documents is verified and legal. Your father spent 40 years building this empire. He was meticulous, brilliant, and absolutely committed to keeping it hidden. Why?" The question came out as a whisper. Why would he live like that? Why would he let me struggle when he could have? "Because he loved you." Victoria's tone softened. "Because wealth of this magnitude is dangerous, Miss Moreau. It attracts criminals, opportunists, people who would use you to get to him. Your father wanted you to have a normal life, a real life. He wanted to protect you. He watched me work 3 jobs. Isla's voice broke. "He watched my marriage fall apart. He watched me sacrifice everything, and he never said anything." "He said everything," Victoria replied, "just not with words. The gallery where you worked. Your father owned the building. He made sure you were paid fairly, that your boss treated you well. The apartment you and Julian saved for, the down payment assistance you received from what you thought was a first-time buyer's program, that was your father. He protected you in ways you didn't see. He supported you without taking away your agency or your dignity." Isla felt tears sliding down her face. "I don't understand." "He wanted you to know you were strong without his money," Victoria said. "That you could survive, that you had value beyond what you inherited. And Miss Moreau, he was right. You are strong. You sacrificed everything for a man who didn't deserve you. You stayed kind when the world was cruel. Your father watched you, and he was so proud." The words broke something open in Isla. She cried, really cried, for the first time since her father died, for the first time since Julian left. She cried for the years of struggle that suddenly made sense, for the invisible ways her father had loved her, for the loss of him now that she understood who he really was. When she could finally speak again, she asked the question that mattered. "What happens now?" "Now," Victoria said. "You come to London, you meet the team, you learn everything your father built, and you decide what kind of legacy you want to create." Isla flew to London 3 days later, first class, a ticket that cost more than she used to make in a month. She felt like an imposter in the expensive seat, surrounded by business travelers in tailored suits sipping champagne and working on laptops. She wore jeans and a sweater, carried a backpack, looked exactly like what she was, someone whose entire world had just been turned inside out. A driver met her at Heathrow, a sleek black car that whispered through London streets, past landmarks she'd only seen in pictures, through neighborhoods where old money lived quietly behind wrought iron gates and manicured hedges, until they arrived at a building in Mayfair, all glass and steel and understated power. Victoria Sterling met her in a conference room on the 18th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Hyde Park, furniture that looked like art, a table so polished Isla could see her reflection in it. Victoria was exactly what Isla had imagined, 50-something, silver hair cut in a precise bob, elegant in a way that spoke of generations of refinement. She shook Isla's hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive. "Welcome, Miss Moreau. Please, sit." Isla sat. Victoria slid a folder across the table, opened it to reveal documents Isla couldn't fully process. Legal structures, corporate hierarchies, investment strategies that used terms she didn't understand. "Your father," Victoria began, "was born Thomas Ashford Sterling. Old money, centuries of it, but he was also a genius, mathematical, strategic. By the time he was 30, he had tripled his family's fortune through investments and acquisitions that reshaped entire industries." Isla stared at the papers. "This is impossible. My father was a philosopher." "He was," Victoria agreed, "because that's what he loved. Philosophy. ideas, the life of the mind. But that was also his cover. Your father valued privacy above almost everything. He didn't want the scrutiny that comes with this level of wealth, the photographers, the social obligations, the constant awareness of being watched. So he created an identity. Thomas Moreau, humble academic, and he lived that life fully. But behind the scenes, through a network of trustees and holding companies, he continued to build. Why didn't he tell me? Isla's voice was barely audible. Because knowing would have changed you, would have changed how you saw yourself, how others saw you. Your father wanted you to develop your own identity, your own strength. He wanted to know that when you inherited this, you would use it wisely, not because you'd always had it, but because you'd earned the wisdom to handle it. Victoria turned the page, pointed to a section that made Isla's breath catch. See this? Sterling Holdings has controlling interest in 43 major corporations, including several technology firms, one of which is a client of Morrison and Blake, Julian's firm. Yes. Victoria's expression didn't change. Your father owned the building they operate in. He had investments in several of their largest clients. He never interfered, never pulled strings, but he watched. And now, all of that, all of those connections, those holdings, that power, it's yours. The weight of it pressed down on Isla. She thought about Julian, about Camille, about sitting in that courtroom being told she was nothing. And now she owned pieces of the world that Julian thought he'd conquered. Share this video right now if you've ever wanted to see karma work in real time. If you've ever wondered what happens when the person everyone underestimated turns out to hold all the cards. Because what Isla does with this information, how she chooses to use this power, it's not what you think. And you need to see where this goes. Isla didn't make any immediate decisions. Victoria and her team spent 2 weeks walking her through everything. The holdings, the investments, the foundations her father had quietly funded, research into renewable energy, scholarships for first-generation college students, medical research, environmental conservation. Her father hadn't just accumulated wealth. He'd used it purposefully, carefully, in ways that made the world measurably better without ever attaching his name to it. She met with financial advisors who explained market dynamics in language she slowly began to understand. Legal teams who outlined the structures her father had created to protect assets and minimize exposure. Industry experts who walked her through the companies she now controlled, the technologies they developed, the ethics they practiced, the futures they were building. It was overwhelming, exhausting. Isla spent 14-hour days in conference rooms absorbing information, and then she'd go back to the hotel Victoria had arranged, a suite overlooking the Thames, and she'd sit by the window and think about her father, about the double life he'd lived, about the burden he'd carried alone so she could have freedom. One night, unable to sleep, she called Victoria. It was late, past midnight, but Victoria answered like she'd been awake. "I have a question," Isla said. "Why me? Why not set up a trust? Hire professional managers? Why give all of this to someone who has no experience, no training, no idea what she's doing?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because your father didn't want this empire managed. He wanted it lived. He wanted someone who understood that money is a tool, not a goal. Someone who had suffered enough to have empathy, who had sacrificed enough to understand value. You're not inheriting a fortune, Miss Moreau. You're inheriting a responsibility. And your father believed, no, he knew, that you were the only person who could handle it the right way." Isla stayed in London for 6 months, learning, planning, grieving in a way she hadn't been able to in that budget hotel room. She began to understand her father's vision, the careful balance he'd maintained between wealth and privacy, between power and humility. She began to see that he hadn't been absent from her life. He'd been present in every way that mattered, just invisible. And she began to understand something else. Several of Julian's biggest clients, the ones who had made his career, who had put him on track for partner, they were all connected to companies her father had owned, companies she now controlled. It would have been easy to destroy him. One phone call, one directive to the right people, and Julian's career would evaporate. His reputation would collapse. Everything he'd built would turn to dust. But Isla didn't want revenge. Not yet. She wanted to understand the full picture first, wanted to learn how to wield this power responsibly, wanted to become the person her father had believed she could be. So she watched, and she waited, and she learned, and while she was learning, Julian's world was beginning to crack. It started small. A tech startup that had been on the verge of a major acquisition suddenly had their funding pulled. The investor, a subsidiary of a holding company, Isla, now controlled, changed their priorities, decided to invest elsewhere. The deal fell through. Julian had been managing the account. He took the fall. Then another client left, took their business to a competitor. No explanation, just a polite letter thanking Morrison and Blake for their service. Julian couldn't understand it. These were solid relationships, profitable accounts. Why would they leave? Then a third client, then a fourth. Small losses on their own, but together they created a pattern, a narrative of failure that followed Julian's name. His trajectory toward partners stalled. Meetings he used to be included in happened without him. Bonuses shrank. Opportunities went to other associates. Camille started asking questions. "What's happening, Julian? I thought you had everything under control. You said you were on track for partner. You said we were building something." Julian didn't know what to tell her. He worked longer hours, stayed later, took on more cases, tried to prove his value, but the losses kept coming, and the firm's senior partners started looking at him differently, not as a rising star, as a liability. Isla watched from London, not with satisfaction exactly, but with a growing understanding that actions had consequences, that the universe had a way of balancing scales, that the man who had told her she was nothing was discovering what nothing actually felt like. She returned to her father's house after 6 months. It looked the same, books everywhere, papers scattered across his desk, the faint smell of pipe tobacco still clinging to the curtains. But Isla saw it differently now, saw the life her father had lived here, the careful separation between his public identity and his private truth, the choice he'd made every single day to prioritize meaning over spectacle. She kept the house exactly as he'd left it, moved back in, set up her laptop in his study, and began the work of deciding what kind of legacy she wanted to create. 1 year after the divorce, exactly 1 year to the day, Morrison and Blake faced a crisis. Their largest account, a multinational investment group representing billions in potential revenue, was considering taking their business elsewhere. The relationship had been profitable for 15 years, but the client had concerns about ethics, about the firm's direction, about whether their values still aligned. The senior partners assigned Julian to save the relationship. His career depended on it. This was his chance to prove he still had value, to show that the string of losses had been bad luck, not incompetence. Julian prepared for weeks, researched the client's priorities, developed proposals, practiced presentations. He was confident. This was what he was good at: negotiation, persuasion, making people believe in him. The meeting was scheduled in Geneva, neutral territory. The client wanted to discuss the relationship face-to-face before making a final decision. Julian flew out with Camille. She'd positioned herself as his professional partner now, advising on strategy, helping with presentations. She wore an expensive suit, designer, the kind that whispered rather than shouted. Julian wore his best. They looked like success, like power, like people who belonged in rooms where billions of dollars changed hands. They arrived at the conference room, confident. The space was impressive. Glass walls, view of the Alps, furniture that looked like it cost more than most people's cars. The kind of room where important decisions happened. And then the door opened, and Isla walked in. She looked different, not flashy, not dripping in designer labels or jewelry. But there was something about her now, a quiet authority, a calm that filled the room. She wore a charcoal suit, simple, perfectly tailored. Her hair was pulled back. She wore her father's watch, the only jewelry she needed. Behind her walked Victoria Sterling and a team of advisors, professional, prepared, moving with the efficiency of people who did this every day. Julian's face went pale. Camille's smile froze. They stared at Isla like they were seeing a ghost. Victoria spoke first. Her voice was smooth. "Professional, Mr. Moreau, Ms. Brennan. Allow me to introduce Isla Sterling, chairwoman of Sterling Global Holdings and majority stakeholder in the investment group you're here to meet with today." The words hung in the air. Julian couldn't speak, couldn't process, couldn't reconcile the woman standing in front of him with the woman he'd divorced, the woman he'd told was worth nothing, the woman he'd left with nothing. Isla sat down, folded her hands on the table, met Julian's eyes with an expression that gave nothing away. "You have 15 minutes to present your proposal." Julian stammered through it. The presentation he'd practiced for weeks came out incoherent, desperate. He kept looking at Isla, trying to understand, trying to make sense of what was happening. Camille sat frozen beside him. All her confidence evaporated. She looked small, ordinary, nothing like the woman who had smiled in that courtroom a year ago. When Julian finished, when his 15 minutes of humiliation were over, Isla was quiet. The silence stretched, became unbearable. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm, clear, final. "I've reviewed your firm's performance, your ethical record, your treatment of employees and clients. I've made my decision." Julian leaned forward, hope and fear battling on his face. "We're moving our account to a different firm," Isla said, "one that aligns better with our values. Your contract will be terminated effective immediately. You'll receive standard notification and severance terms." "Isla, please." Julian's voice cracked. "You can't do this. We were married. You know me." Isla stood. Victoria and her team stood with her. "I did know you," Isla said quietly. "That's why I'm doing this." She walked out without looking back, left Julian sitting in that glass-walled room with the view of the Alps and the weight of his own choices pressing down on him, left Camille staring at the space where Isla had been, realizing that she'd attached herself to the wrong person, that she'd bet on the wrong future. The door closed with a soft click, and Julian sat there in the silence, understanding for the first time what he'd lost. Not the account, not the career advancement, but the woman who had loved him when he was nothing, the woman who had given him everything, the woman he'd convinced himself was worthless. That woman now controlled more wealth than he could comprehend, had more power than he could imagine, and she'd just erased him with the same calm efficiency he'd used to erase her. If you felt that moment right there, if that hit you exactly where it needed to, hit that like button right now and subscribe to Mr. Black Love Drama TV, because we're not done yet. Because what happens next, the aftermath, the choices Isla makes, the life she builds, that's where the real story is. That's where we see what true power actually looks like. And I promise you, it's not what you think. Camille left Julian 3 weeks later. Isla never knew the details, never cared to find out, but Victoria mentioned it in passing during one of their weekly calls. Apparently Camille had moved on to another man, another opportunity, someone whose career was still ascending, whose star hadn't begun to fall. Julian tried to reach out, called Isla's old number. It was disconnected, sent emails to addresses that bounced back. He even showed up at her father's house once. But Isla had security now, discreet, professional. They turned him away without her ever knowing he'd been there. His career never recovered. Morrison and Blake didn't fire him, but they sidelined him, gave him smaller accounts, passed him over for promotions. He became exactly what he'd once feared. Ordinary, forgettable. The guy who used to be someone. But Isla wasn't tracking his decline, wasn't measuring his suffering against her satisfaction. She was too busy building, creating, becoming. She established foundations in her father's name, scholarships for students from working-class backgrounds, the kind of kids Julian had been, the kind of kids who deserved chances, grants for artists and writers who wanted to make beauty accessible to people who thought it wasn't for them, funding for medical research into diseases that didn't get enough attention because they affected people without wealth or power. She invested in companies that prioritized ethics, that paid living wages, that treated employees like human beings instead of resources. She divested from industries that profited from suffering, from exploitation, from treating the planet like something to be used up and discarded. She used her wealth the way her father had, quietly, purposefully, making the world measurably better without needing credit for it, without needing her name on buildings or her face in magazines. And she went back to school, enrolled in a doctoral program in art history, her old dream, the one she'd set aside to support Julian's ambitions. She studied, wrote papers, attended seminars, not because she needed the degree, but because learning mattered, because ideas mattered, because her father had taught her that the life of the mind was worth living regardless of wealth or status. She started teaching too, adjunct at first, then a permanent position at the same university where her father had taught. She loved it, loved watching students discover that art wasn't just for rich people, that beauty belonged to everyone, that meaning could be found in a Renaissance painting or a contemporary installation or a piece of street art someone had created with spray paint and hope. Her students had no idea who she was, not really. They knew her as Dr. Sterling, tough but fair, brilliant but approachable, the kind of professor who actually cared whether they learned, who stayed after class to answer questions, who wrote recommendation letters that opened doors. None of them knew that the woman grading their papers controlled billions, that she could buy the university 10 times over, that she was one of the wealthiest human beings on the planet. And that was exactly how Isla wanted it. 2 years after her father's death, 2 years to the day, Isla drove to the cemetery. She brought flowers, simple daisies, his favorite. She sat beside his grave for a long time, just sitting, just being present. "I understand now," she said softly, "why you lived the way you did, why you kept it hidden. You wanted me to know I was enough on my own, that I didn't need money to have value. You wanted me to build my own identity, my own strength. And then, when I had that, when I knew who I was without the wealth, then you gave it to me, because you knew I wouldn't let it define me, wouldn't let it change me. Thank you, Papa, for everything, for seeing me, for protecting me, for believing I could handle this." She stayed until the sun began to set. Then she drove back to the house, her father's house, her house now. And she made tea in the kitchen where he'd made tea every morning for 20 years. And she sat in his study surrounded by his books. And she felt at peace in a way she hadn't felt since before Julian, since before the divorce, since before she knew about the money. She had something far more valuable than wealth. She had purpose. She had her father's legacy. She had the knowledge that the people who had underestimated her, who had treated her like she was nothing, had been catastrophically wrong. 3 years after the divorce, Isla was invited to speak at a philanthropy summit in New York. She almost declined. Public speaking wasn't her strength, never had been, but Victoria convinced her. "People need to hear your story," Victoria said. "Not the money part, the part about resilience, about choosing purpose over revenge, about what it means to use power responsibly." So Isla went. She stood on a stage in front of hundreds of wealthy donors and foundation leaders, people who measured success in zeros and impact in press releases, and she told a version of her story, not Julian's name, not the details of the betrayal, but the essence of it. "My father taught me that wealth isn't about what you own," she said. "It's about what you do, how you use your resources to make the world more just, more beautiful, more kind." He lived 2 lives so I could learn that lesson. He endured the loneliness of hiding who he was so I could discover who I am. And now, I'm trying to honor that, not by building monuments to myself, but by building opportunities for others. She talked about the foundations, the scholarships, the research grants, the companies that prioritized people over profit. She talked about her students, about the joy of watching someone discover that they belonged in spaces they'd been told weren't for them. The applause was long, genuine. People stood. Afterward, dozens of attendees approached her, wanted to talk about collaborations, about joint initiatives, about how to make philanthropy more effective and less about ego. Isla stayed for hours, answering questions, exchanging ideas, feeling for the first time like she'd found her people, not because of shared wealth, but because of shared values. As she was leaving the venue, preparing to catch a car back to her hotel, someone called her name. She turned, and there was Julian. He looked older, thinner. The shine was gone from his eyes. The confidence that used to fill every room he entered had evaporated. He wore a decent suit, but not an expensive one. He was alone. "Isla, can we talk? Just for a minute." She should have said no, should have walked away. But something in his face, something broken and real, made her pause. "1 minute," she said. Julian looked at the ground. I know I don't deserve your time. I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back. But I need you to know I was wrong about everything, about you, about what mattered. I thought success meant money and status and leaving behind everything that reminded me of where I came from. And I lost everything that actually mattered. His voice cracked. I lost you. And I didn't just lose a wife. I lost the only person who ever loved me for who I was, instead of what I could give them. Camille left. The second things got hard. Everyone else, they disappeared when I stopped being useful. But you loved me when I had nothing, and I threw that away because I was ashamed of having needed you. Because your love reminded me I'd been weak once. And I'm sorry. I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry. Isla was quiet for a long moment. She looked at this man who had once been her whole world, who had promised to build a life with her, who had discarded her the moment she became inconvenient, and she felt nothing, not anger, not satisfaction, just a quiet acceptance that some people don't learn until they lose everything. Julian, she said finally, I forgive you. His head jerked up. Hope flickered in his eyes. Not because you deserve it, Isla continued, but because I deserve to let it go. Because carrying anger takes energy I'd rather spend on things that matter, on people who matter. You made your choices. You have to live with them, but I don't have to carry them anymore. She turned and walked away, and this time, finally, she didn't look back. So let me ask you this. If you were in Isla's position, what would you have done? Would you have forgiven Julian? Would you have destroyed him? Would you have stayed silent and let karma do its work? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know, because here's what I know. Underestimating someone is one of the most dangerous mistakes you can make. The person you dismiss today might be the person who defines tomorrow. The person you treat as worthless might be carrying a worth you cannot begin to fathom. Isla Moreau became Isla Sterling, not because of money, not because of revenge, but because of strength, because of choice, because she refused to let cruelty define her or bitterness consume her. She took her father's legacy and made it her own. She loved without condition, grieved without shame, and rose without revenge. And in a world that often mistakes noise for power, she proved that the quietest voices can carry the most weight. Some victories aren't won in courtrooms or boardrooms. They're won in the mirror. When you look at yourself and recognize the person staring back, when you realize you survived what was meant to break you, when you understand that your value was never determined by the people who failed to see it. Isla's father knew that. He spent his life teaching her that lesson in 1,000 silent ways. And when the time came, when the world tried to tell her she was nothing, she proved them all wrong, not with words, not with spectacle, but with the quiet, unshakable knowledge that she had always been enough. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that the person you are when nobody's watching matters more than the person you pretend to be when everyone is, then I need you to do 3 things. First, hit that like button and let me know this resonated. Second, drop a comment telling me, would you have chosen revenge or grace? I want to hear your perspective. I want to know what this story made you feel. Third, subscribe to Mr. Black Love Drama TV and turn on notifications, because we're telling stories that don't just entertain, they transform. Stories about real people facing real struggles and discovering strength they didn't know they had. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's been made to feel small, someone who's wondering if their kindness makes them weak, someone who needs to remember that the quietest power is often the most devastating. Because here's the truth this story teaches us. You are not defined by the people who failed to see your worth. You are not measured by those who underestimated you. You are not diminished by those who walked away. You are exactly who you've always been, strong, valuable, enough, and sometimes the universe has a way of making sure everyone else figures that out too. I'm Mr. Black Love Drama TV, and I'll see you in the next story.